welcoming tonight. When Ted asked me to speak, he said, can you talk about the Steamboat project you're working on and somehow connect it to the West Village waterfront? You'll see when I talk you through this that it's not quite a reach, but there is a little creativity, but the waterways connect everything. So I hope you'll see that the Hudson River in particular is just really a story of connectivity, and the Greenwich Village waterfront happens to be at one end of a much larger route that takes you all the way to the Midwest. I just want to start, I know you're all Greenwich Village experts at this point, so my history tonight is going to focus primarily on the waterways and how the waterways directly impacted land use and development in the West Village and in the Hudson Valley, and even as far west as the Midwest, as Buffalo, Detroit, and Toledo, looking at those landscapes as well. But I just want to point out that it's really the waterways that made Manhattan great. The city's connection to the European markets, and later its connection to the rich resources of the area we now call the Midwest, are what pretty much made New York the #1 harbor and port in America, surpassing New Orleans, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Boston. And a look at the Greenwich Village waterfront really tells a larger story of a city, of a region, and of a growing nation. A story of economic development, of changing technologies, and as I mentioned, above all, a story of connectivity, of people, of places, and goods. We'll look at how the river went from a highly congested corridor, which you're seeing here, to a less utilized route, and how changing ideas about recreation and leisure not only impacted what you see on the water itself today, but also what you see along the water's edge. From finger piers filled with ships and barges and warehouses to accommodate the goods, and hotels for seamen, to a waterfront that we now have filled with parks and ball fields and very little access to the water itself. This was supposed to be a little morphing map, but we're not connected to the internet. If anyone knows the site Mannahatta, it's a wonderful project by Dr. Eric Sanderson of the World Conservation Society, WCS, and he has mapped Manhattan from 1609 to today. So if you go on his website, reliquia.org, which is difficult to remember, you'll see that ideally I would hit play at this moment and we'd see the 1609 landscape morph into the landscape today. So you'd see the changing waterfront, you'd see the infill for what is now the West Village waterfront that we know. You'd also see the finger piers coming and going, and you just kind of get a sense of how the West Village waterfront has really been transformed. The Hudson River, from the mouth of the harbor to its start in Lake Tier-of-the-Clouds, has gone by many names and has been described by many men. The Lenape called the Hudson River the Chattahoochee, meaning the river that flows both ways, because the river alternates its flow from north to south along the Atlantic tides. The river actually is saltwater up until just south of Poughkeepsie, and so it's very tidal in that sense. The Chattahoochee was an important route for the Lenape, who would harvest the resources of the sea and river, oysters, fish, and they would trade among the Hudson River region. Early explorers also came into the harbor, but many of them, including Verrazano, thought the river was nothing more than an estuary at that point. So it's really the Dutch who first explored the Hudson River. And as you know, Henry Hudson was the Englishman sailing for the Dutch East India Company. He explored the river in 1609, and this is an image of his boat, the Half Moon, sailing upriver. The Dutch at this point called the river the Mannahatties, and then the Dutch that followed in Henry Hudson's footsteps referred to the river as the River of Prince Mauritius, and they also referred to it as the North River. They referred to it as the North River because they called the Delaware the South River. And together, these two rivers really formed the spine of the Dutch colony of New Netherland. Its strategic importance as the gateway to the American interior led to years of competition between the English and Dutch over the control of the river and the control of the colony. Henry Hudson's name, Hudson, applied to the river in 1664 as the English tried to justify their takeover of the region. The English argued that since the explorer was the subject of England's king, Hudson's River belonged to them, not the Dutch. In any case, to many colonial authorities and European investors, the American landscape was only as good as its connections to the European markets, as I mentioned. And boosters and speculators in the 18th century highlighted the rivers and harbors of England's colonies to spur settlement and investment. The American harbor was filled with clipper ships, which were the sailing ships designed more or less along extreme lines for utmost speed, and also smaller ships, brigs, barks, schooners, engaged in trade overseas and also domestic ports. They would bring sugar and molasses from the Indies, cotton, tobacco, lumber, and marine stores from the South, or manufacturers from New England. Here you see some of the sloops on the Hudson River. Also, this is the Clearwater, which is the replica sloop that Pete Seeger's organization built in the 60s. So one of the things about that really impacted the development of alongside the Hudson and also the traffic you see along the Hudson today and throughout history are really changes in technology. And the first change in technology was the advent of steam. In 1807, Robert Fulton teamed up with promoter Robert Livingston to attract public attention around the voyage of the Clermont, which steamed up the Hudson River from New York City to Albany in 1807. Fulton became known as the father of the steamboat. The early steamboat service in America was steam ferry service from Hoboken to Manhattan, to points on Long Island, to New Haven, and to Staten Island. By the 1850s, faster and safer steamboats and steam ferries were in use on all these routes, and steamships were running to the south as well as to Europe. On the Hudson River and Long Island Sound, the steamboats had wiped out the sloops and the packets, and you can see here, this is in the this is 1873. You can see all the steam engines, both that are circling up the Hudson River and also East River and heading towards the European points. Another one of the major technological changes or developments that impacted the West Village and all the Hudson River was the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825. And the opening of the Erie Canal really opened New York City up to the west, which was significant. So the boats would come up to Albany, up to Waterford, and head out. And this connected them not only to the farms and agricultural lands of upstate New York, but it also connected New York City to the Midwest, to the Great Lakes. So by traveling through the Erie Canal, you could suddenly get to Buffalo, you could get to Toledo, Detroit, all the way to Chicago, and you also had the route that took you north through the St. Lawrence River. So you had the chance to trade with Canada and those ports as well. This is the celebration of the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 in Manhattan. The opening of the Erie Canal changed the way the city developed in a number of ways. One, the goods that were coming down. Here you can see some apples that were getting ready to be loaded onto these barges. But because New York no longer had to rely on, New York City rather, Manhattan no longer had to rely on producing grain for themselves, they could bring it from upstate New York. This changed the way we farmed in places like Brooklyn and Staten Island. So farms in Brooklyn and Staten Island actually got smaller at that point, and farmers tended to grow goods that were more for the market. So they grew perishables, they grew a lot of produce, they had a lot of dairy, things that were for the immediate market as opposed to things that could travel great distances. This I just wanted to point out again, you can see the route up the Hudson out, and then you're suddenly connected to this much larger network. And it was really this connectivity of people, goods, and ideas. It was a region that was linked by waterways. Ken Jackson calls the Hudson River the river that built America. And I think it's because of all these connections that you see that it did, in fact, really grow in that direction. So taking it a little bit closer to home and bringing it back to the West Village for a moment, this is the Commissioner's Plan of 1811. So you can see there was to be all this landfill here to extend the West Village. And that was in fact built out. So you can see here the map of 1847. And I just wanted to talk briefly about some of the infrastructure in the West Village and how that changed over time. So you had the piers of the West Village. Here's the 1885, where you can still see 13th Street here. And you've got these small piers here that are better suited for sloops. And you see that changing in the early 20th century, you have what are called the finger piers because they're long and they stick out and look like fingers. You can also see that West 13th Street is no more. And you can see Gansevoort Market over here. So you just get the sense of how the boats were changing and the dock infrastructure that was required and the warehouses required for all the goods that were coming really impacted the West Village. Here you can see that markets were always an important part of the West Village. So this is West Washington Market in the 20th century. So you can see all the, there are a number, like near South Street, there are all the oyster shops that were out and other trading establishments. Here's a little bit earlier, one of the oyster markets from 1898, a drawing from 1898 showing the oyster market along Christopher Street. You also had infrastructure to house the goods that were coming in. So you had warehouses being built along the piers. Here you're seeing West Street, south from near Bethune. Here you're seeing some of the 1950s warehouses along Pier 27, 28, 29. And one thing, I don't know if everyone knows this, but there's an easy way to figure out the pier and the street, and it's subtract 40. It gets a little bit difficult when you're going below numbers, but if you're at Pier 84, you can subtract 40 and know you're at 44th Street. So once you get below Pier 40, you have to have a little better sense of the street grid to know where exactly you are, but if you're anywhere above Pier 40, you can easily figure out what the cross streets are at that point. So here you're seeing more of the piers. The railroad was there's obviously a connection to the railroad, so goods were being taken by barge and then transported directly onto the railroad, and then they could also go to points west. They were being transported to Hoboken, and they were also going upriver via train. There were also a number of seamen's hotels that were built along the waterfront at this point. So this is what is now the Jane Hotel. It was the American Seamen's Friends Society Sailors Home and Institute that was built. The year for that was 18, let's see here. I think it was 1890, someone may know that better than me. 1907, and now later the Jane Hotel. So there are a number of seamen's hotels that were built up at this point. But one thing that I wanted to kind of talk about is jumping somewhat quickly, but it's what happened to the piers with the advent of containerization, when a lot of the finger piers were no longer necessary because you had these big ocean-going liners coming with goods packed in the containers. So they needed huge amounts of empty land to store the containers and also to just operate the cranes and the equipment needed to move these containers. So at that point, a lot of the port traffic ended up moving to Elizabeth, New Jersey, and also to points in western Staten Island. There's still some of the container ports over there. So the finger points piers all around New York City, not just the West Village, but Staten Island, the East Village. These finger piers, there suddenly was no use for them, and there suddenly was no use for the warehouses. Another thing, it wasn't just the containerization, it was also the advent of better transportation systems via car and trucking routes that also diminished the necessity for these piers in the way that that was there before. But the piers, because it's a regional story, the kind of rise and fall of the West Village waterfront is a similar story to what you'll see up and down the Hudson River, and also what you'll see when you move out to points west in the Great Lakes. So I just wanted to point out kind of this rise and fall. So here you see Poughkeepsie's waterfront in 1908 upriver. It obviously didn't have as many of the places for the canal barges to come in and the infrastructure you would have in the West Village being a terminus, but it did have shipping routes coming in, and it had leisure boats coming in, and it was an active waterfront with warehouses and factories and goods being exchanged in both directions. You saw the same thing on the Yonkers waterfront. Here's the Yonkers waterfront in the 1900s. The same thing in the Newburgh waterfront, where you can see the day liners coming in, and you can see the factories along the waterfront and some of the warehouse infrastructure on the waterfront. But as the finger piers went in the West Village in the 60s and 70s were no longer useful at that time, the waterfront in these Hudson River communities and in places in the Midwest like Buffalo, like Toledo, like Cleveland also fell into hard times. So here you can see the 1960s, what the Newburgh waterfront is looking like at that moment. I just want to kind of quickly flash back to Hudson River Park today. Here's Pier 45, so 5th Street, thereabouts, and point out kind of what's become. Because we all know that the parks have been reimagined. And I imagine many of you live in the village and have walked here, experienced this. But it got me thinking about this idea of connectivity and reinventing the waterfront. I bring this up because here are popular things to do. I went on the Hudson River Park Trust website today, and there is kayaking here, but otherwise there's very little that actually gets you on the waterfront or that connects you to points outside of New York City. So this whole idea of the West Village was so connected. It was connected by commerce to all of these points, not just in the Hudson River, but the Midwest as well. Now we've got recreation and leisure on the waterfront. But again, how far can you take your kayak? Maybe you're a strong kayaker. I don't think I would get very far on my kayak. But this idea of, is leisure a way that we can again restore these connections and this connectivity that we once had? So here's an image of Pier 25, and the Hudson River Park Trust has designated several of the piers for historic vessels. So there are historic vessels can suck tie up. So here you see the Lilac, the Tug Pegasus, the Lehigh Valley Barge. All of these historic vessels are the connection to the past and the present, and they tell the story of what the harbor was like and of ports far away. So there's somewhat this idea of connectivity still possible when you think about the boats that are on the waterfront today. So jumping to kind of the idea of leisure and connectivity, New York, not necessarily the West Village, had a huge tradition of leisure vessels, day excursion boats that would take people from 42nd Street or 125th Street up to the Hudson Valley. So you'd be able to go hiking at Bear Mountain, you'd be able to go up to West Point, you'd be able to go shopping in Poughkeepsie or just go up to Cold Spring for the day. And perhaps the most famous of these vessels were the Hudson River Day Line vessels. And these ran from the late 19th century through the 1970s. So here's the travelogue. The daylight sail between New York and Albany is nature's greatest movie. Here, I just wanted to show you some of the images of the boats. So many of them were designed by the same architect and interior designer. The architect was Frank Kirby. Kirby was a guy who grew up in the Midwest. He came to New York and went to Cooper Union. He ended up building several of the Hudson River Day Line boats at that point. Then he went back to the Midwest to build more boats and then came back here to build more boats. So Kirby has a connection of these same types of vessels. You'll see not just, you would have seen not just in the Hudson River, but you would have seen them in Lake Erie and Lake Ontario and along the Detroit River and the Maumee River as well. So here's the steamer Albany in Albany. Here it is again. Most of these boats could hold somewhere between usually 2,700 people to about 4,000 people. And they're absolutely massive. To give you some sense of scale, most are about 2/3 the size of the Staten Island Ferry to being the size of the Staten Island Ferry. And they'd have 4 decks, steam powered, and viewing the steam engine was so much a part of the experience of these vessels. It was the magic of that technology, and the main deck of these boats would have a viewing platform. So you'd actually be able to lean over and look at the pistons pumping, and you'd feel the heat coming off, but of course the steam engines are silent. It was just this absolutely incredible sound, and people remember the smell of the engines, and that's it, the motion and the smell of the engines. So you had these boats that I think kind of live in the memory and imagination of a lot of New Yorkers. Here's the Robert Fulton. Here are 3 of the Dayline boats landing at Bear Mountain. So Bear Mountain was the popular hiking and fishing destination. There were a lot of church groups that would leave the piers at 125th Street and go up to Bear Mountain for the day. Here is an amusement park up in Kingston Point Park. So the Dayline boats not only took people to enjoy nature and get out of the city, they took them to amusement park areas and casino-type establishments as well. So this is Kingston Point Park, where nothing remains except the old Dayline dock there today. Here's Hudson, New York, where you can see the boat getting into the icy waters. The last of the boats went out of service in the 70s, and here is a New Yorker article from 1971. The article is written by Tony Hiss, and he remembers what it's like riding the Alexander Hamilton, and there are all these wonderful illustrations like this, and he also just describes the people on the boat. And you get the sense that these boats really were the people's boat. You had people on the upper decks with picnic baskets, eating roast chicken, drinking wine, you had kids running around, you had church groups. It was pretty much a space, a very democratic space where people were just taking the opportunity to get out of the city and escape. These are the architect Kirby O'Keel, who designed most of these boats. And I wanted to show you some of the other boats that they designed so you get the sense that this wasn't just a phenomenon that was happening in New York City, but this idea of the day excursion, this idea of leisure on the water was something that was happening through the Midwest region and through the Northeast and Midwest. So this is the Canadiana. She was built in 1910. This is one of the images from her first journey. But you can see she's got the same lines, same deck configuration as the Hudson River boats. This boat, unfortunately, was scrapped in 2004 after efforts to save her did not move forward. But her engine is in the Maritime Center up in Buffalo. The Canadiana and her sister ship, the Americana, much in the same way that the Hudson River boats would take people to Kingston Point Park, would take people to Crystal Beach, which was in Canada, just about a half-an-hour ride from Buffalo. So you also had these boats in Detroit. So this is an image of Detroit's two boats, the Boblo boat. There's one of them. There's the St. Clair and her sister ship, the Columbia. So these boats were built in 1902 and 1910, and they served the same purpose. They would take people from downtown Detroit an hour and a half west in the Detroit River to Boblo Island, which was a Canadian amusement park. That island went out of service in 1991, and the boats had pretty much been shrunk, they were shrunk wrapped, put in a dock in River Rouge, Michigan, and left. And it's really just the sheer perseverance of a group of Detroiters, preservationists, maritime enthusiasts, who kept this boat going, kept both boats going. They check on her at night. There's an elaborate system of alarms and whistles. I mean, you can imagine the difficulty in a place that was a setting that had a Praxair compressed gas plant on one side and a U.S. steel plant on the other, where hot piping rolls of steel were still coming out of the factory via train. So these two boats were kind of sandwiched in that landscape. So that kind of brings me to talk a bit about the project I've been working on, which is to really bring back this tradition of the day excursion boats that we had in the Hudson River. And to find the boat to do this, we had to go to Detroit. Since the Hudson River, the Dayline boats, the Hudson River Day Line boats, one sank off the coast of New Jersey, one was used for a restaurant in Boston and sank, one was scrapped. There were no more Hudson River Day Line boats. But there are two boats designed by the same architect with the same lines, same configuration that were in Detroit. So one of the boats, the SS Columbia, will be coming to the Hudson River, and the other boat, the St. Clair, will be staying in Detroit. This is where the boats were sitting since 1991. So this is the Columbia here, and then there's her sister ship, the St. Clair. You can see the railroad tracks that I was mentioning here. The gas plant was there. There's another shipyard over here. I mean, it was just the bleakest environment you could possibly imagine. Very American landscape. And this is what we call her glamour shot. This is what she looked like in the 1910s when she was in service on the river. So just to give a bit of history about this boat, she was built in 1902 at the Detroit Dry Docking Company, which is in Wyandotte, a few miles east of the river from Detroit. She launched May 11th, 1902. We actually found some newspaper articles on the Columbia from May of 1902, so it was somewhat interesting to find stuffed under in the corner of the boiler room. There were all these artifacts that seemed as though someone had left us a time capsule from 1902. I just wanted to show you some shots of her steaming upriver. So So everyone always says, well, are these boats environmentally friendly? They didn't smoke this much, but the photographers love to get them smoking because it gives you that sense of motion. So much to the chagrin of the engineers, they'd stoke the engine, and then this thing would take off with a burst of black smoke trailing behind her. So you'd get the effect that the boat was really moving at great speeds. These boats were actually designed to go about 20 knots, which is quite fast. And it's interesting because there really was no need for them to go that fast. They were just taking you to an amusement park island. Speed wasn't an issue in the way it would be if you were really a commercial trip. But Frank Kirby continued to perfect his design, and I think there were also the idea of speed, particularly on the Great Lakes and in the Hudson River as well, was key, because these boats used to race one another, and you can read about the great races between these steamboats and everything else like that. Here's another image of Columbia. You can see her 3 decks. So the main deck, the engine would be visible over here. She had a ballroom on her 2nd deck. And Columbia's ballroom was the first of her kind on a vessel like that, because Kirby kind of perfected what you can see are these little thin lollipop-like columns on the 2nd floor. So he basically was able to create this uninterrupted space. You'd have views on either side. And this was 1902, so it's just when kind of dancing and the idea of having bands on boats and kind of the concept of having ballroom spaces was coming into vogue. On the 3rd deck here, you had a little bit of a trunk deck where people could take refuge from the sun. And then it wasn't until later that people were allowed up on the front of this 4th deck. Where you're looking at now is her original configuration. She originally was fired by coal, and that was changed in the 1930s. So what you'll see in later images is, oops, which you might see in that, I'll show you later on, but her stack is much lower than it was before. Here's what the ballroom actually looks like. So you can see those lollipop legs and the trusses that they were able to build. And this was then replicated on the other Frank Kirby design boats that came out after that point. Here are some of here's the blueprint for what the woodwork looked like and what the sconces look like in the 1st floor, the main deck. And this is what she looks like today. So there is a lot of restoration work that needs to be done on these boats, needless to say, in part because the former owners thought they were doing these boats a service by shrink wrapping them. But you all know what happens when water gets into a shrunk-wrapped environment. The rot that happens is just incredible. This is the view of her engines as they appear now. So here is kind of the main deck. So you'd be able to look down from the main deck to see these engines and these pistons in motion. But it was common when these boats were in motion that people would be able to go down to the engine room. Not everyone, but people were more than happy to show off these boats, and there are stories that the engineers will tell you of having people come down and showing how these things worked. Being able to operate these is certainly an art, and we still have one, Conrad Milster, who runs the steam plant at Pratt Institute, was one of the engineers on the Alexander Hamilton. So he's one of the few resources we have of what it actually takes to get these boats up and running again, because it is an art to get these engines going. Here's the crew of the Columbia in 1906. The Detroit crowd. It was usually, there's an interesting case that came out about the Columbia and the civil rights history. So before there was Rosa Parks and a bus, there was Sarah Elizabeth Ray and the SS Columbia. Sarah Elizabeth Ray was a high school student who bought a ticket to board the boat with the rest of her classmates, and she got on board, and she was denied. The Boblo boat operators came and said she had to get off the boat. She refused. She ultimately did get off the boat. She wouldn't accept a refund for her ticket, and this case went all the way to the Supreme Court, paving the way for Brown versus the Board of Education. So there's an interesting civil rights story that goes along with this boat, particularly interesting in a city like Detroit, where part of the reason, in addition to the amusement park closing in the late 80s, early 90s, was these boats by the 80s were in fact places where there were lots of fights breaking out, and there's the tension that was happening in the city, and the heat of the city was spilling over onto these boats. Here you see there's the I love the fact that there are folding chairs. The Coast Guard probably wouldn't allow that on any new boats built today, but their grandpa, this idea, we'll be able to have these types of chairs on Columbia today. So the one thing about the boats like this is the Coast Guard would never allow you to build a boat that has the superstructure that's all wood. So part of what we're looking at is how we can do our preservation plan. We won't rip all the wood out at once, we'll gradually do it so that the Coast Guard can never say, you've destroyed too much of the original fabric, now you've got to put plastic in here or plastic in there. So we have a conscious plan for how to keep the restoration process going so that it adheres to the preservation standards, but also to the Coast Guard standards, and we're able to keep the wood superstructure. Here's our vision for Columbia sailing up the Hudson River. So this is Columbia sailing under the walkway over the Hudson Bridge in Poughkeepsie. So what we see this boat doing in New York City, once she's up and running, and I'll kind of explain where we are in that process, but we see her, again, connecting New York City to the Hudson Valley. So she'll make trips from New York City to points north twice a week, most likely one with school kids and one for ticketed passengers. So people will again be able to travel up to Cold Spring or to Bear Mountain. And then she'll be docked in somewhere along the Hudson River. We've started the process of looking at some of the dock spaces there. And she'll be used for educational programming during the day, STEM or STEAM as it's called, science, technology, engineering, arts, and math programming during the days. And then because she's such a large vessel, it accommodates over 500 people for a sit-down dinner, the business plan shows that she'll be sustainable in terms of her operating costs. So here she is now. So I just wanted to talk about how we get to that grand vision we have, considering you've just seen the images of what she looks like today. So I'll talk you through what we've been doing. So here is Columbia, docked in River Rouge, Michigan in September of last year, September 2014. We have this incredible crew led by a female tugboat captain based out of Kingston, who goes, you should see her in the shipyard. She's a pit bull and gets whatever we need done in the shipyard. But she's spearheading the actual restoration effort. So she's put together this wonderful crew of colorful characters, a guy, Florida Joe, who drives up from Florida to help out on the project, and will tell you that the boat really does look like a woman. And some of her other past mates from New York. She's worked on a number of preservation projects, boat preservation projects in the state, including the Dave Peckinpah boat up in Albany. So we prepared to move the boat for the first time since 1991 from Detroit to a shipyard in Toledo. So this is the crew from the tug coming to tie up Columbia. You can see her sister ship there, so they hadn't been parted in over 20 years. Here you can see what the ballroom looks like today. This is our board member, Clay Hiles, cheering us on as the boat is being pulled out. There's a tug here, a small tug that's pushing it, but this is the workforce that's pulling the boat out of the inlet where she'd been sitting into the Detroit River. And 4.5 hours later, she arrives in Toledo, and she went right into the graving dock, and you can see her out of water. So she's been out of water since September, and she'll remain out of water until the end of May, beginning of June, when we put her back in. The Coast Guard had last seen the bottom of her boat, the bottom of the hull, about 10 years ago, and they said, oh, she's in really good condition. We had ultrasounds done to test the condition of the hull. We moved her to dry dock, and suddenly we realized there were 2 tons of zebra mussels on her hull, which normally I hate these invasive creatures, but the zebra mussels were in fact holding the hull together. So we had to scrape the first ton of zebra mussels off because it was impossible. You couldn't power wash them down. They were stuck on there. And then the second one came off by power wash rather. But what happened is the boat looked like Swiss cheese. The hull really looked like Swiss cheese in certain parts. Contingency lines for a shipyard, we're learning. Here you can see the hull. It's somewhat difficult to see with this lighting, but you can see the zebra mussels on the propeller, and then there's the propeller cleaned with the zebra mussels. Here they are removing the zebra mussels as fast as they scrape them off. So we began work. We thought we might be able to do more work on the superstructure. Needless to say, most of our time in the shipyard has been repairing the hull. And we've replaced nearly 40% of the hull. And I'll show you some images of us doing that. I should also say that because we're planning to bring her to the Hudson River, a journey, she's too big for the Erie Canal, so she's going to have to go through the Welling Canal, through Lake Ontario, up the St. Lawrence Seaway, and then down the eastern seaboard. So the Coast Guard and the seaway of the way and getting stuck there or anything happening to it. So all of the work that we're doing is very closely monitored by the Coast Guard, Canadian Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard, Seaway Authority, and of course our insurance agent. So one of the things we did to the superstructure was remove these old tarps that had been lying around, making her look like a ghost ship, prompting Michael Bay to cast her in Transformers 4 as the ghost ship. So if you've seen that movie, you will see her, unfortunately, being blown up. But that is a Michael Bay movie. So here's the Coast Guard guys with Anne, our project manager, checking out the hull. This is the hull of open. So you can see it's a double bottom hull, which is somewhat unusual for Kirby design boats, which means that there are in fact two hulls. Which it was also wonderful news when we discovered how much of this outer hull had been deteriorated. So here you can see the beam, so there's another hull behind there, but we needed to get this outer hull repaired to 5/18 of an inch steel. So we ended up, as you can, replacing about 40%. So this is some of the corrosion that you can see. These are the guys in the machine shop at the shipyard preparing the plates. So what they do is they take these plates, they put them into position, they kind of clamp them down, and then they'll go through with the torches and weld them into place. There, you can see them welded. We had to go around and number each of the plates. We have these elaborate drawings that show the thick plate, the hull thickness for each plate, what's been replaced, red plate that we had to replace, green plate that we should replace, and then good plate. But what we've ended up replacing will pretty much get her certified for passenger. So she won't have to go into the shipyard for major repairs to the hull for at least another 10 years. So here you can see very large pieces cropped out. They have to do repair work to the rivets. So there are two ways of doing it. You can either replace the whole rivet or you can do what's called Frenching them, which is just torching them into place. So we were able to do that. We ended up replacing or Frenching 950 rivets. There you can see the French rivet. There are so many unexpected surprises that we've already had happen in this process. One is that we discovered all these field stones in the hull of the boat. And the speculation, and they're all put in there, and then someone poured cement in to make sure that they really weren't going anywhere. And the speculation was that the boat was riding too high when they changed the dock, the amusement park dock, so they had to weigh her down. So to do that, they put the local field stones in, poured cement in, sealed her back up, and no one knew anything. There was no record of this. So this took the shipyard guys a week with jackhammers. I think we lost, what's the number? 180 nail bits trying to get to jackhammer this, the fieldstone and cement out of the hull. We protected all the engines, so here you can see the engines just wrapped up. We also had to do some work on the roof, just preparing for a winter in Toledo and the winds and the snow that were coming. So here you can see Florida Joe up on the roof kind of fixing or recladding the roofing material for fear that it would blow off. But our next steps, we still have, the ship, as I mentioned, is still out of water, and it will be out of water until May. And we're going to do more repairs to the ship. There are two more steel plates that need to be replaced that we just couldn't get to before the cold weather hit. So we'll be doing that in the spring. We'll put her back in the water at the end of April, beginning of May. And then we are towing her to New York State. So we're going to have a welcome to New York State arrival celebration. We're bringing her to Buffalo. and she'll be in Buffalo for a year. And there's so much happening on Buffalo's waterfront, and with the connection between the Kirby-designed Americana and Canadiana, we'll have her in the harbor there. We'll continue the work to the superstructure, and also, while we feel we have a wonderful vessel, we haven't yet created a movement of people who want to see this project happen. So we'll be doing lots more events here in New York City and also in Buffalo. Summer of 2016, we'll tow the boat from Buffalo to the Hudson River, ideally stopping in New York Harbor for a week, and then she'll be moved up to Kingston, New York. And that's where the bulk of the restoration will happen. And the faster the money comes in, of course, the faster we can spend it, but we estimate the restoration is going to take between 2 to 3 years. But Kingston's a great port because the Clearwater boat's up there, there's the Hudson River Maritime Museum, there are a number of other historic tugs up there, the Cornell tug is up there, and there's also a shipyard up there. And there are a number of shipwrights up there who can work on the interiors. So Kingston to us seems like the ideal place, and then we will ultimately bring her to a port in New York City. So that's it.